Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Super Me. This is a Netflix movie that I just stumbled upon because it was basically as soon as you can get into the app, it's like, hey, watch this movie. And I'm like, okay, you've won me over by that. So I went into this movie, and of course, it is a dubbed film, which was great. Uh, this to me kind of very much reminds me of a Nightmare on Elm Street kind of movie. It's not 100% a horror film. It just comes up that way where like it seems like the idea like was stolen from Nightmare on Elm Street and they kind of took that and ran with it. To me, this also kind of reminds me of the Hayden Christensen movie Jumper, but instead of it actually being where this person jumps from one location to another and can consistently do that, we end up having a person who can jump as soon as he falls asleep from one location and have whatever he has taken from that location when he wakes up uh, to come with him. And so that technically is a jump of sorts. Going into this movie, I would say that it's very visually interesting, but there isn't much else other than that. Like, to me, I was just like, okay, like, I'm just enjoying the ride of this movie, but, like, it never really, to me, actually goes anywhere. Like, it really doesn't, like, to me, the journey of it was interesting. It was an enjoyable ride. It was just the fact of, like, okay, there is no real true like superhero element to this. It's basically just like you're going to see the same montaging like thing over and over and over again until this main character has just decided that he has gotten way too far much of money, and now everyone is going to eventually try and want to figure out how this guy has gotten this rich, has gone this successful, and so on and so forth. Really, we have it to where really this movie really just comes down to money. And we have it to where our main character saying seems to be seemingly this desperate Esh like character. We end up having this guy being a screenwriter of sorts, and it seems like he is having a hefty amount of problems sleeping because every time he ends up falling asleep somewhere, he ends up seemingly in his dreams being attacked by some uh, uh, demonish or demonic looking character. And so we end up having our main character realizing that eventually, once he is to fight every single one of these demons, he is to also eventually pull something from that dream into reality. So it's kind of like a very much Nightmare on Elm Street kind of thing. We don't have our hero pulling back a demon from his world, but towards the tail end of the movie, we kind of have something along those lines. Um, but anyways, really within this movie, we kind of have this real confusion consistently about whether or not that this is real and true reality or really a dream or whatever. Like we consistently have it to where like I'm kind of wondering or pondering whether or not uh we could keep going along with this and keep saying that every single thing that this guy is seeing is a dream, and eventually we could possibly have an alternate version of this movie where the entire time Sang is actually in some mental hospital somewhere because his mind just broke because he hasn't slept for X amount of days. That could be a possibility, or maybe he could have just died on the side of the road from not sleeping for X amount of days. We end up having this main character having seemingly insomnia, and he cannot be able to get seemingly anything done. We have a guy who is hounding him for money because uh, it seems that he had gave him an extension to be able to write this story, and we end up having Sang, who is having difficulties producing this story because of his insomnia. But eventually, we end up having it to where it seems that this movie may have a happy ending at the end of it. Yeah, I thought that this movie was visually interesting. There was some cool things going on with this story, but really, I felt overall that this movie didn't exactly seem to really go anywhere. It was just like there was just a consistent montaging of things that I guess that this guy just had to eventually just forcibly do because he just had a ton of money lying around. And so we have this guy who eventually goes into like, well, uh, how about I just make uh, how about I just take all this money that I have just earned and be able to help people? How about I take this money and be able to make these absurd like things just because I have the money to, because I'm getting it from my dreams, and so on and so forth. I like the journey of this. I like the concept of it, but overall, it like towards the very tail end of this movie, it just kind of just has to do something because it has to end somehow. And so reasonably like there was stuff about this movie that I was like, okay, but this movie needs to go somewhere, but it just didn't. I honestly would have actually liked this if it was actually a show rather than a movie. I think that you could probably break this down a lot more and actually have it be a show. And I think people I think people would actually accept this. Like if you would have stretched it out a little bit more and made it into a show. Um, but with that said, yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know if people will be 100% won over by this being whatever it is, but because nothing is really explained in this movie, it's just like, okay, well, this guy just has nightmares. And really, that's just all that's really just explained. So, with that said, let me try to explain this movie that isn't exactly explained. And so, let's get into this. Let's get into spoilers. I would say, because people might be pondering, well, should I watch this? Should I not watch this? I would honestly say it's a good filler of time, but it's just a movie that just is a concept and it just doesn't go anywhere beyond that. And it tries to also like resolve itself in within this movie. So it's kind of like it's somebody that I think just wanted to just make money off this movie. Like really basically the way of which that they make this movie is kind of the obvious like, well, hey, like somebody really just needed to make money and so they hoped that this movie would be it, is kind of what I think what they were trying to do and what they were trying to accomplish. Like I think somebody, whoever wrote this, more than likely was just probably actually having this kind of story in their actual life, to where they were just trying to chase and get more money, and really they had to just dream about it to be able to put this whole movie together. So with that said, let's go into, if I haven't already, let's go into that double five. So, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, we have a main character named Singh who, like I had said, he is dealing with insomnia. It seems that he's on a subway and I guess even falls asleep in a subway, and it seems that he is being attacked by some monster, some demon of sorts that is of the color blue. It seems like every single one of the demons of which that this guy ends up fighting is of a color blue, and it seems that these demons tend to have different stereotypical personas or stuff along those lines. It seems like they have different kind of barrages of weapons. I think the first one that ends up attacking Sang has some sort of sorts to where eventually Sang eventually pulls this sword from this dream and eventually goes off to try and sell it. So we end up having Sang, who is to eventually have uh, a guy that makes pancakes, a sort of pancakes. We end up having this guy telling, saying that he should eventually realize that when Sang is inside of his dream, before this demon tries to kill him within this dream, that this guy tells him, like, well, hey man, how about you just realize that this is just a dream and that you should wake up? And so we end up having Sang realizing that and like, well, hey, that sounds like an actually good idea. We end up having Sang, who is basically running from everything in his life. We end up having Sang running from his landlord because he owes him rent, and of course he doesn't have rent. To the point to where eventually we end up finding Sang stuff in front of his like in front of his room to basically say, dude, like, you're out of here. We end up having Sang eventually having to collect all of his stuff and to basically just kind of like not really have a home. He's basically homeless. That's how bad things were getting. And we end up having Sanji, who is to be chasing after Sang, because it's like, dude, hey, I give you an extension on you writing this story, so hurry up and write it. And Sang is like, dude, I've had insomnia and I just can't deal with writing a script. Every time I try to do it, it just doesn't work out. Because his insomnia is preventing him from sleeping and preventing him from getting his job done and all kinds of other excuses. So we end up having it to where eventually Sang, like I says, or like I had said, he ends up going into a dream where he ends up getting attacked by some demon, and so he ends up going and pulling the sword from his dream and waking up with it. And he's like, oh, wow, like, I can now just go ahead and try to find a place that is going to sell this sword. And it seems bizarrely that everybody was like clamoring to get this sword off this guy's hands. And so we eventually have Sang, who takes this sword to some guy who is going to give him $5,000. And he's like, well, hey, that's great. But I think he ends up trying to haggle for $20,000, which of course he gets. We end up having Sang, who is like, oh my god, I am living the high life. Like, man, like, I'm going to go and clean myself up. I'm going to shave myself and all kinds of things. We end up having, at some point, how Sang had gotten this sword is we end up having this guy who had gone to this grocery store, and he was almost going to steal all the food so that way he can eat. But eventually he realizes that there was a camera placed somewhere, so Sang ended up deciding to put the stuff back and walk out of the store. Barely kind of eating whatever he could because he had no real money left to him. And then eventually he ends up having this dream while he is talking to some old friend of his, some old flame of his, and he ends up dreaming about this whole situation with this sword. And so we end up having, at some point, Sang ends up waking up somewhere in the middle of this store because he ends up crashing through the window and crashing into one of the aisles, and he ends up waking up with his sword in hand. So we end up pushing on. So we end up having Sang, who is to realize how like expensive a lot of these items is that he can quite possibly get. we have it to where Sang is going off to nightclubs, meeting women, taking them home with him, but then realizing that, like, dude, I don't actually need these women. I'll just pay them to go away. And so we end up having Sang going and sleeping it off his hangover to eventually look at some book with these high end, expensive like items. And so we end up having Sang who ends up dreaming that he's in this location. And so we end up having Sang going and looking at some expensive items. And so he ends up trying some of this stuff on, or he ends up kind of playing with it, kind of waiting for him to eventually wait for the villainous guy to come in to try to attack him. And so we end up having Sang kind of like playing around with certain things to just kind of see like whether or not that he could collect some of them. And so we end up having a guy come in with some kind of like old fashioned machine gun. And so we end up having Sang who is to eventually try and avoid these shots coming to him. And so we end up having it to where Sang tries to grab onto things to eventually try to attack this person. But we end up having Sang who ends up waking up to eventually go and take some sleeping pills to go back to sleep so he can try and steal some expensive items from his dream. And plus also try to take this demon out. It seems that eventually Sang gets a little bit more like confidence under his belt, or maybe he ends up doing a little bit more training or karate training or something, because eventually we end up having it to where Sang ends up like easily like taking out these demons every single night that he tries to fight them. But eventually we end up having Sang eventually either getting stabbed or some kind of thing, one and the other. And so eventually we end up having Sang's wounds come back to haunt him because he ends up thinking that I guess I'm not going to have any of these wounds when I wake up. Well, eventually we get there. So we end up having Sang who is to go and get these seemingly expensive items and selling them for 1 million yen. And so we end up having some guy coming to him and asking him, like, hey man, like, how is it exactly that you're getting these items? Like, this doesn't seem like, what is it that you do for a living? How is it exactly you're getting these things? Are you a thief? Are you a this? Are you a that? And Sang is like, well, yeah, I'm just getting these items and I just don't want to, like, tell anybody how exactly I'm doing it. I shouldn't have to tell anybody. And so it seems that that is going to eventually come back to haunt him too, because eventually we have a person that is going to put uh, a a bag over Sang's head and eventually pull him off to be like, dude, how is it that you're getting all of this money and how is it you're getting all these things? This makes no sense. So we eventually have it to where Sang is to go and do so well within his dreams. Eventually, once Sang gets this 1 million yen, we end up having Sang who gives Sanji 20 grand because of interest and to really pay him back for giving him this extension, and he takes him on a lavish meal. And we have San who is like, wait a minute, why is it that you all of a sudden have all this money now? This makes no sense. Let me know exactly how that you're being able to do this, and basically let me just like be your butler for the rest of your life. So we have Sang who eventually ends up showing Sanji how exactly he is able to collect all these high-end items, and Sanji just basically becomes Sang's right-hand man, just consistently watches over him as this guy sleeps, or San eventually ends up falling asleep while Sang is falling asleep. And so eventually San is just the guy that collects all the wealthy things that Sang brings out of his dream, and so on and so forth. He's the guy that is going to sell all of his stuff, and so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where Sang wants to try and start to help people in the community. It seems that Sang wants to help out uh, the cafe lady uh, that I think he has a romantic entanglement with. And so we end up having Sang, who ends up going to this coffee owner. I think her name is Hooray, Huaer, Horror, Hooray. I don't know her name. Candy Song, I guess, is her real name. So I guess we're gonna go with that. Um, but I could have been saying these names all completely wrong this whole entire time. I don't know which one's the actual real name and which one's the. Because Sang Yi is Darren Wang, and Candy Song is Herrera, and we have Koa Bing Hearn, which is Sang Ji. Or Koa Bing Kun, who is Sang Ji. And, okay. I don't know which one's the actor's name or which one. I've said Sang Yi so many times. So, anyways, we go on to here, and that's what happens when you go through a certain app that is an IMDb and figure out who freaking is who. So, anyways, because IMDb had like nothing for for like the cast of this show or this movie. So we go on to have Sang, who ends up going to help out this cafe, this coffee shop worker, to the point to where eventually we end up having Sang sending out Sanji to just go and give people money to buy a coffee in this cafe, and we end up having also that Sang also wants to help the assorted pancake guy that had helped him out earlier, and so we end up having Sang, who ends up just kind of giving uh, this assorted pancake guy, he ends up just giving him money because it's like, hey, here you go, like thanks for helping me. So we eventually have Sang, who ends up putting together as much money to eventually just buy this cafe place, this coffee place. And the girl ends up behind the counter, like saying, like, well, I probably need like 1.5 million to be able to keep this place afloat. And so Sang ends up giving her that money. And so she's like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you buying this place? Like, what is this to you? And eventually she ends up having lunch with him, or ending up having like dinner or something with him, and she ends up telling him, it's like, well, hey man, like if you're married or if you're taken, it's like I want absolutely nothing to do with you, like in that way, like in a relationship kind of way. And Sang just kind of laughs at her, and he's like, like no, I'm not even close to anything like that. Eventually we also get to the point of this woman eventually asking Sang what exactly he does for a job. And so we end up having Sang having to tell her in a very cryptic like sense, and then she ends up mentioning that it's like, oh, well, you're a screenwriter. And he's like, well, yeah, like sure, that's what I do, because that's what he did before he turned into a dream collector. So we end up having this woman who is saying, like, well, Like, it would actually be really nice if I could be able to actually see one of the movies that you've done, so I can understand like that you have actually like the reason why you have so much money is because you actually did a movie that I actually did see. So we end up having Sang, who is to basically go, well, okay, well, I need to actually do a script now. And so we end up having Sang, who ends up writing a script, and then eventually we end up having Sang, who has so much money on his hands to where we end up having Sang Ji, like, basically sick the dogs on any of these people that it's like, well, hey, like, if we're gonna make a movie, we're gonna make like the best movie that we can with this script. We're gonna basically hire the best actors to do this and whatever because we have unlimited resources. So we eventually have it to where Sang eventually ends up doing like 20 movies and all kinds of things, and we end up having Sang, who is supposedly this very wealthy guy, to where he ends up going into these like honoring Sang for all of the work that he's done because of and they have to do a whole biography on him and all kinds of things of showcasing like how this guy has come into prominence and so on and so forth. Like this whole movie begins with eventually Sang going and trying to do research on the brain, trying to realize that he goes to one woman that I think is like a yoga woman or something, a very meditative like person, and she ends up talking about like how people only use like a fraction of their brain and like the rest of the part of their brain is a monster. And we end up also having another guy in some conference somewhere giving some speech about the brain and stuff like that. So, and I kind of skipped around about that, but eventually it comes like tail end towards the tail end of the movie to go into that scene as well. So I guess I should talk about it. So we eventually have it to where Sang just decides, well, you know what I'm gonna do since I have so much money. Like I'm just gonna go and build this skyscraper of a building to just have any number of people just live in there. Just the homeless, pirates, villainous people, whoever. Like, I'm going to give them a home to live rent free just forever if that's what they want. And so Sang has that plan. And so while that ends up going on, we end up having it to where since Sang has way too much money, like more money than God basically, we end up having a villainous person that ends up pulling a bag over this guy's head and is now basically trying to hold Sang for ransom. 'Cause it's like, dude, like I want your money. Like, how is it that you have so many of these resources? This makes no sense anymore. How is it that you can do this? Are you a thief? Are you what are you? Like this makes sense no longer. And so we also have I kind of skipped around about it. Uh, we also had other dreams where Sang basically goes into a vault filled with money, and Sang ends up like putting all this money in these bags, and he ends up trying to fight off this demon, and he has much more control over the dreams, so it seems that he can have any kind of resource to go and fight off these villains, to where he does pretty well at fighting off these villains, these demons. And so eventually we end up having it to where Sang eventually dreams of a fancy car, and he ends up fighting a demon, quite easily taking him out. And we end up having it to where when Sang wakes up with this car in his apartment building or in his apartment. And so it's like, how exactly did they get this car from point A to point B? This makes no sense. But I guess it is what it is for this story's purpose. So yeah, we end up having him dreaming of all kinds of things that he tries to uh, either get or collect or whatever. So back to the guy that is ending up holding Sang for ransom. So we end up having Senji, who is to give this guy money for Sang, and so we eventually have it to where they they end up giving Senji ends up giving them the money for Sang's ransom, but that's really not good enough. We end up having it to where these villainish people go on to Sang's apartment building, and so we end up having it to where they are to go like, well, I want to see everything, like I want to know everything, and so we end up having Sang eventually showing him their like his trophy room where he basically has like all of these gold things, all of this gold everywhere. Like at some point we end up having Sang who ended up collecting a like a wrestling looking belt from off of one of these demons, and he ends up waking up with this belt, and Singji is like, dude, like this looks awesome. So we end up having all these villainous people once they realize the trophy room that this guy has. We end up having it to eventually, one by one, that these villain people end up starting to kill Sang's friends off. We end up having it eventually where Sang's girlfriend ending up making her way to uh, is making her way to his room, and so Sang has to let her in. Sang was trying to dump her or try to get her to go away, but she didn't. So we end up having Sang, who is going to lose his best friend. Eventually, it seems that his best friend was killed by these villainous people, and eventually we end up having it to her also saying at some point while his last dream had happened, it seems that every single one of his wounds that he had gotten while being hurt by any number of these demons finally did show up upon his face. He ends up having a scar upon his face. He ends up having cuts around his body, and it's starting to seem like his dreams are consistently wounding him actually, which I'm like, okay, like I thought that would have happened a lot sooner, to where like every single one of these wounds when Sang would have woken up would have actually just like been like scars or something like that. But I guess that didn't actually happen. So we end up having Sang, who is to, with all of his friends, eventually to be killed off, to where it seems that Sang is in some demon world now, where he is to go and seemingly turn into a demon himself, to where this demon ends up coming into reality via bursting through this wall. We end up having the goons checking out, like, okay, well, hey, where is this demon coming from? And there is no opposite side of where this demon is coming from. So we end up having this demon break through and go and kill every single one of these villainous goons. And so we were just like, okay, like, what is this supposed to symbolize? That, like, if you are too greedy of a person, that you'll turn into a monster, and, like, it's a monster that you can no longer control? I don't know. But we end up having it to where the demon ends up killing all the villainous people, and then eventually he ends up grabbing Sang and almost killing him because Sang was like almost dead, but this demon wants to make sure that Sang is fully undead. So here's the thing. So we end up having Sang who ends up waking up at that same grocery store with his love of his life waking him up. So where that moment earlier where we had that girl who was like, "Hey, do you remember me? Hey, do you like know me? Whatever." And then all of a sudden we end up having Sang who had gotten beaten up by that demon. We now have Sang who is back at that moment talking to that girl who is basically asking him, it's like, well, hey, like, do you want to go somewhere and get something to eat? Like, it looks like you're starving. And so we have Sang who ends up going to this girl to get food, and she offers to have him work at her cafe to eventually, like, try to get some money together. And so that whole thing that had happened had all been a dream. That whole entire thing, I guess, him dozing off for like a second and then waking up, I guess was like all that entire dream that had happened. So we end up having it to where that Sang ends up starting to work at this cafe. It seems like he gets enough money together to pay off Sang-ji. And so Sang-ji ends up sitting down with Sang and saying, you know what? Hey, man, like, it's great that you gave me all this money, but guess what? Like, the one movie that you had written for, it actually had made like a ton of money. So here you go. Here's a ton of money for you to do whatever the heck that you want with. So we end up having it to where Sang is like, okay, great, like, so things are going to work out well for me. So we eventually have Sang going back to the assorted pancake guy, to where we end up having this assorted pancake guy giving him back the sack of money that I guess this assorted pancake guy had been a part of Sang's dream. We end up finding out the assorted pancake guy had also been through the same kind of route that Sang had been, to where he lifts up his shirt to see that he had a scar on his chest. So we end up having the assorted pancake guy who had gone through the exact same wrong as Sang had, and he had, I guess, realized just as much as Sang did that money isn't everything. So I guess that's kind of the message of the story, that I guess money isn't exactly everything, because eventually somebody's going to take it all from you, or a demon is going to kill you over it, or whatever. So with that said, that's kind of the way of which that this movie just kind of tends to end, where like there isn't any like real true legitimate end of this movie. It's just kind of like showcasing that part. So with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. Kind of a very goofy, odd like film. There's probably a lot of stuff that I probably kind of skipped around about, or there was stuff that I probably just didn't get to because I don't like. There's stuff where I just the montaging of it all. Like we end up having one scene where Sang is to fight off a demon in this like hotel uh like hallway, and we end up having that's the like battle axe moment where eventually we end up having Sang eventually selling off this battle axe for a good piece of or chunk of money, and so that's when we have the battle axe going and stabbing him, and then he ends up waking up and selling like, oh my god, look at this cool battle axe. But every single bit of this eventually comes into just a dream, which means nothing. So it's just like, okay, well, I guess this dream or this idea or whatever, like, really is going to be a thing for this guy to eventually do another movie. which is going to make him, I'm sure, a ton of money. So, kind of a goofy story, but yeah, that's all I got. It's just a goofy story. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, everybody.